Pickups are supposed to be tough, reliable, and safe. But in the Wild West of 20th century American auto manufacturing, safety was often an afterthought. Some were unstable, others rusted into dust within years, and a few were downright explosive. These are 10 American pickups that didn't just put drivers at risk. Rugged on the outside, reckless underneath, these trucks left a trail of broken frames, shattered bones, and bitter lawsuits. Let's take a ride through 10 pickups that should have come with a warning label, or a last will and testament.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. The 1960 Ford F100 is a darling of classic truck enthusiasts. With its squared-off styling, wrap-around windshield, and unmistakable stance, it's often seen as a symbol of American ruggedness. But that nostalgia often masks a darker truth. It was one of the most dangerous vehicles you could drive in its day. Let's dismantle the myth and examine how this tough old pickup was, in fact, an engineering relic that offered little to no occupant protection. In 1960, crash safety engineering was still a distant dream. The F100's body-on-frame construction meant the frame was incredibly rigid, and all that crash energy, it went straight into the cab and your spine. There were no crumple zones, no energy-absorbing materials. If you hit something hard, the structure didn't give way. You did. Steel dashboard of death. The dashboard was solid steel. No padding, no collapsible steering column, no soft surfaces. A head-on crash meant your face was meeting raw metal at 60 miles per hour. Seatbelts weren't mandatory in trucks, and even lap belts were optional. Many owners didn't bother with them, and shoulder belts weren't even in the conversation yet. The F100 had a straight axle front suspension with leaf springs, which meant the ride was absolutely brutal, especially unladen. Every bump, pothole, or gravel rut turned the truck into a mechanical rodeo. That rough ride wasn't just uncomfortable, it also made the truck unstable in emergency situations. Sudden maneuvers could send it bouncing or sliding unpredictably, especially on wet roads. The truck sat high off the ground, and with its narrow track and tall stance, it was genuinely top-heavy. Combine that with vague, unresponsive steering, and you had a recipe for rollover if you ever had to swerve. The F100 was equipped with four-wheel drum brakes, which were prone to fade under repeated use. Drive it downhill for too long, your stopping power disappeared like smoke. No power brakes. Most models didn't have power-assisted brakes. You were relying on pure leg strength to bring the truck to a halt. In a panic stop, this meant long stopping distances and poor brake modulation. The F100 used recirculating ball steering, which was notorious for excessive play in the wheel. Vague steering feel. Slow response times. So if you had to make a split-second decision to avoid a crash, the steering system wouldn't cooperate. You might turn the wheel, and the truck would follow about half a second later. With a light rear end, the F100 had terrible weight distribution in rain, snow, or even loose gravel. The rear tires lost grip easily. The truck would fishtail at the slightest provocation. Drivers were left fighting to maintain control, especially if the bed was empty. It was rear-wheel drive, of course, but without modern traction control, ABS, or limited slip differentials, you were on your own. Cab design. The cab itself was a thin sheet of metal with minimal reinforcement. If the truck rolled, the roof could collapse like a soda can. No roll bars, no support beams, just you and some hope, fuel tank placement. While the F100 didn't suffer from the Pinto-style tank issues, the fuel tank was still behind the seat, inside the cab. In a rear-end collision, you had fuel and electrical components within a few inches of your spine. People loved the F100 because it was durable, simple, and easy to fix. But none of that made it safe. It was designed in a time when safety was not a design priority, and government regulations hadn't yet forced manufacturers to consider occupant protection in serious crashes. Toughness does not equal safety. A rigid vehicle without energy management systems doesn't protect you in a crash. It simply transfers all that energy to your body. The 1960 Ford F100 is a great-looking truck. It's part of a golden era of styling and simplicity. But under that classic charm lies a death trap on wheels. No crash protection, unforgiving suspension, fading brakes, top-heavy balance. No modern safety features. Owning or admiring one today is perfectly valid, as long as you understand the risks. The F100 was a work tool, not a safety-engineered vehicle, and in any serious accident, it offered style over survival. Number 9, let's start with the surface. The 1960 Dodge D100 looks tough, even a little futuristic by the standards of early 60s pickups. With its angular fenders, wraparound windshield, and tall stance, it screams rugged Americana. But that's where the admiration stops, because under the steel skin of the D100 was a brutally outdated machine with almost no regard for driver or passenger safety. Let's break down exactly why this handsome hauler was a death trap in disguise. Straight axle front suspension. The D100 suspension was built for carrying hay bales, not for handling or comfort. A solid front axle with leaf springs meant the ride quality was punishing. On any uneven surface, it would jounce and bounce like a mechanical bull. No weight equals no traction. When unloaded, which was often for daily driving, the rear end was light as a feather. A little rain or gravel was enough to turn this truck into a tail-happy sled, making oversteer common and accidents all too easy to find. No power assistance. The D100 steering was manual recirculating ball, which meant slow input, heavy effort, and almost no precision. You'd turn the wheel and then wait for the truck to maybe change direction. Eventually. Excessive play. Worn components added up to inches of slack in the wheel. You weren't just driving, you were negotiating with the truck, especially at higher speeds. On winding roads or in emergency maneuvers, this was downright dangerous. Four-wheel drums. Like most trucks of the era, the D100 had drum brakes all around, but Dodges were especially underwhelming. Brake fade happened fast under load, and stopping distances were long even when they worked. No redundancy. There was no dual-circuit master cylinder, which meant one leak equals total brake failure. And with no power assist, you were relying on pure leg power to get this steel sled to stop. No crumple zones. There was no concept of crash absorption. The D100's body-on-frame construction was rigid, meaning all the impact energy in a crash went straight into the cab and you. Steel dash and sharp edges. The dashboard was bare metal, and everything in the cab was a blunt object waiting to injure you. Steering columns didn't collapse. Armrests were steel or hard plastic. In a crash, it was you versus the interior, and the interior always won. Zero rollover protection. These trucks sat high and were incredibly rollover prone, yet the cab was made of little more than thin-gauge steel. If it flipped, the roof could collapse instantly, often with fatal consequences. Loud, uninsulated, and distracting. The cab of a 1960 Dodge D100 was a sheet metal echo chamber. There was no sound deadening, minimal insulation, and massive road and engine noise at all speeds. Not only did it fatigue the driver on long trips, but it also made it hard to hear approaching traffic, warnings, or even your own failing brakes. Safety is more than crashworthiness. It's about situational awareness, and this truck robbed you of it. There were no airbags, no ABS, no stability control, no side impact beams, no crush zones, no energy-absorbing steering column, and rarely even seat belts unless a conscientious owner installed them later. Your only real protection was luck, or maybe a sturdy pair of boots to stomp the brakes hard enough. The 1960 Dodge D100 is a great truck to look at and a fun truck to restore for shows. But from a safety standpoint, it was a rolling hazard from the moment it left the factory. Let's summarize why. Punishing ride made control difficult. Sloppy steering delayed reactions. Weak drum brakes and no backup systems. No structural crash protection whatsoever. Thin metal cab with dangerous interior components. Zero modern safety features, even by 1960 standards. In short, it was built to haul, not to protect. A workhorse, not a guardian. Number 8, the Studebaker Champ was not your typical pickup. Introduced in 1960, this compact truck was a cost-cutting innovation born out of financial struggle. Studebaker didn't have the funds to develop a new truck from scratch, so they did what many cash-strapped companies do. They Frankensteined one together, using the front half of the Lark sedan, their compact car, and mating it to a truck bed. Studebaker essentially built a pickup on a car chassis. Years before the term crossover meant anything. It was clever, sure, but it was also dangerous in ways Studebaker didn't intend. The Lark front end. The front of the Champ was essentially a sedan. That means it had car-sized wheels and tires, car suspension components, a car steering rack not designed for payload or heavy-duty use. This made the front end light and nimble, but also fragile and unfit for the demands of a pickup, especially when loaded down or pushed hard on rough roads. The back half. Old-school truck. The rear end used a leaf-sprung axle and truck bed borrowed from older Studebaker pickups, but it didn't balance well with the lighter front, leading to poor weight distribution and inconsistent handling. The Champ was dangerously light in the rear when unloaded. This had several scary consequences. Tail-happy oversteering corners, especially in wet or icy conditions. Poor braking stability, as the rear end would easily lock up. Skittish behavior at speed, making it feel twitchy and unstable on highways. In rain, it was a drift machine, except you didn't want it to be. A quick lane change or a panic stop could spin it into the ditch. Let's talk about what happened when a Champ did crash. No crumple zones. Being built on a sedan platform didn't mean it inherited safety tech. There were no crash absorption structures. All crash energy was transferred straight to the cabin and the occupants. Weak side protection. Like most trucks and cars of the era, the Champ had thin doors and no side impact beams. A T-bone accident was practically a guaranteed injury event. Rigid cab, soft frame. The frame didn't bend to absorb force. The passenger compartment did. Seat belts were optional and often missing, meaning drivers were thrown into the metal dashboard or steering wheel. Unpredictable steering. Steering response was vague and easily overwhelmed by poor alignment or worn parts. And because it was based on a car platform, turning radius and road feel weren't up to truck standards. Brake system issues. Most Champs came with four-wheel drum brakes, which suffered from fade under load, poor wet performance, no backup hydraulic circuit, meaning a single leak, total failure. Frame flex. The mismatched car-truck hybrid construction meant that frame flex was common. Over time, the bed and cab could even shift relative to one another. Not a good sign for structural integrity. It's worth noting, Studebaker was trying something bold. By blending a compact car with a pickup, they were anticipating the future, decades before the Honda Ridgeline or Ford Maverick. But the execution just wasn't safe enough. They solved the wrong problem. Instead of building a truck that could perform safely, they built one that could be cheaply marketed. The 1960 Studebaker Champ deserves credit for being an early example of clever platform sharing and a compact truck for personal use. But the safety issues were impossible to ignore. Oversteer prone in wet conditions, lacked even basic crashworthiness. Unbalanced handling due to mismatched components, flimsy cab and no meaningful rollover protection. In short, it was a truck with car parts pretending to be tough, but failing to protect its occupants when it mattered most. Number 7, by 1960, International Harvester IH was no stranger to trucks. Unlike Ford or Chevy, who balanced style with substance, IH was strictly utilitarian. The B100 pickup, introduced that year, was a tough, no-frills machine meant for farmers, contractors, and anyone who didn't mind a bone-jarring ride. But that utilitarian mindset came with serious safety consequences. The B100 wasn't just crude, it was dangerously outdated by 1960 standards. Rigid construction, no energy absorption. IH bragged about its strong, ladder-style frame and heavy-gauge steel body. And yes, the B100 could take a beating, but that toughness worked against it in a crash. No crumple zones, no deformation on impact. All crash energy transferred to the cabin and to the passengers. In a collision, the B100 didn't absorb the blow. You did. Drivers often suffered severe injuries even in moderate speed crashes because the truck was just too rigid to protect them. Safety wasn't even an afterthought in the B100. It was ignored altogether. No seat belts, no padded dash, no headrests, sharp metal interior edges everywhere. The steering column was non-collapsible, meaning in a frontal impact, it often speared the driver. The bench seat was just bolted to the floor with no bracing, and the metal dashboard was like a blunt force weapon waiting to happen. The B100 came with manual, four-wheel drum brakes, and they were barely adequate when new. Once loaded, or descending a hill, stopping became a test of courage. Long stopping distances, brake fade under heat, no power assist, no proportioning to adjust front-rear balance. In rain or snow, lockup was inevitable. You didn't stop in the B100. You eventually came to a rest, hopefully without hitting something first. Here's where the B100 really earned its reputation for farm implement handling. Solid front axle and stiff leaf springs front and rear. Manual steering box with tons of play. High center of gravity, swinging tail under braking or on uneven roads. Drivers often described it as fighting the truck, not driving it. Every bump transferred directly through the uninsulated frame to the cab. Cornering was not advised. The top-heavy design meant it felt ready to tip at any moment. Virtually no sound insulation, no suspension damping. Metal dash and door panels echoed every vibration. Driving the B100 at highway speeds was an auditory punishment. And because the suspension was so stiff, passengers got bounced around constantly. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous, especially on rough roads or during evasive maneuvers. The B100 represents an era when trucks were expected to be tools, not transportation. But as more Americans began using pickups for daily driving, this kind of outdated brute force engineering became a serious liability. The idea that tough equals safe just didn't hold up. In fact, it was often the opposite. Trucks like the B100 didn't crumple, didn't protect, and didn't allow you to avoid accidents. The 1960 International Harvester B100 was the kind of truck that could run forever, as long as you never crashed it. Built to survive harsh work conditions, it was never designed with you in mind. The rigid frame and crude suspension made it durable but deadly. It's a reminder that durability doesn't mean safety, and that overbuilt vehicles with poor engineering are often the most dangerous ones of all. Number 6. The 1960 Chevrolet C10 was a big deal. It marked a major shift in General Motors' truck design philosophy. Gone was the solid front axle, replaced with a revolutionary independent front suspension that promised a smoother ride and more car-like handling. But while the C10 looked modern and drove softer than its predecessors, it was far from safe. In fact, the very design choices that made it innovative also made it dangerously unpredictable. For decades, trucks had used solid front axles, which made them stiff, crude, and uncomfortable. In 1960, Chevy changed that with short, long-arm, independent front suspension, IFS, and coil springs on half-ton models. This meant a smoother ride on paved roads, better steering responsiveness, on paper, improved tire contact over bumps. But in practice, it was a double-edged sword. A. Light rear end, unstable handling. With no load in the bed, the rear of the C10 was feather light. Combine that with a soft front suspension and vague manual steering, and you had a recipe for erratic handling, unpredictable rear-end slides on wet or loose surfaces, rear axle hopping during hard braking or cornering, prone to oversteer when decelerating into curves. Drivers found themselves wrestling with a truck that could swing out without warning, especially on winding or uneven roads. B. Steering, floaty and untrustworthy. The C10's steering was notoriously imprecise, with massive play in the wheel and no feedback to the driver. Cornering felt like a gamble, especially with narrow tires and a tall center of gravity. Safety simply wasn't part of the design conversation in 1960. The C10 came equipped with practically nothing. No seat belts, optional, barely offered, no headrests, no crumple zones. Steel dashboard, pointed knobs and metal steering column. In a crash, the interior became a metallic minefield. The steel dash and steering wheel were hard and unforgiving, often causing severe facial or chest injuries in even moderate accidents. And because lap belts weren't standard, many occupants were simply thrown forward in a collision, often right into the windshield. Four-wheel drum brakes, manual brake system, long stopping distances, no brake assist or dual circuit protection. Combine that with a loose rear end and vague steering, and it meant that emergency maneuvers were more hope than skill. Panic stops often ended in spinouts, especially if the rear wheels locked first. Minimal insulation. The cabin was deafening at highway speeds. Bench seat with no bolstering, meaning you slid around during turns. Flat glass and metal door panels added to the echo chamber feel. The ride quality was marginally better than earlier trucks, thanks to the IFS, but only in a straight line. The rest, still a violent, bouncy affair with limited occupant protection. The 1960 C10 was groundbreaking, yes, but it was also a reminder that mechanical progress often outpaces safety. GM gave the C10 better ride quality and comfort, but didn't engineer the safety systems to match. It straddled two eras, the tail end of post-war truck ruggedness and the early edge of the modern pickup. But while it moved the industry forward mechanically, it left drivers dangerously exposed in terms of crash safety and control. The 1960 Chevrolet C10 deserves its place in history for pioneering ride quality improvements in pickup trucks. But make no mistake, it was also a safety nightmare. Light in the rear, unstable at speed, vague in steering, and utterly unequipped to protect its passengers in a collision. It's a textbook case of how innovation without safety can be just as dangerous as no innovation at all. Number 5. The 1960 Chevrolet Corvair Ramside was part of Chevy's ambitious Corvair line, a series of vehicles that broke away from Detroit tradition. The Ramside variant was a compact pickup truck with a side-loading ramp, aimed at tradesmen and delivery workers who needed easy loading in tight spaces. Unlike conventional trucks, it featured a rear-mounted, air-cooled flat-six engine, unibody construction, independent suspension, a novel, car-like driving feel. To many, it looked like the future, but in reality, it was an engineering experiment with some frightening consequences. Chevy moved the engine to the rear to free up cargo space and lower the floor. This allowed for the signature side ramp that gave the Ramside its name, a brilliant feature for wheeled cargo. But that also meant a massive rear weight bias, unconventional handling dynamics, increased oversteer risk, especially in emergency maneuvers. When unloaded, the front end had very little weight, which made steering light, vague, and inconsistent, especially in wet or icy conditions. The rear engine layout led to a swing axle rear suspension, which was notorious for one thing: sudden, catastrophic oversteer. Here's how it worked or didn't work. The swing axles allowed the wheels to tuck under during sharp cornering. This caused loss of rear tire contact patch, which could instantly break traction. Once that happened, the rear end would snap around, spinning the truck. This wasn't just theory. Real-world drivers experienced dangerous spins in routine driving, especially during lane changes, highway exits, or emergency braking. The Ramside's cab design prioritized weight and cost, not crashworthiness. Thin metal side panels. No door beams, no crumple zones, no padding or internal structure. In a side impact crash, there was almost zero energy absorption. Occupants were essentially sitting in a tin box that could cave in under relatively low-speed impacts. No headrests, lap belts optional at best, steel dashboard with hard knobs and switches, no airbag or collapsing steering column. The seats were simple benches, offering no support in crashes or rollovers. During sudden movements, the driver and passenger could be thrown side to side and into the doors or dashboard. That side ramp was brilliant for accessibility, but it also reduced structural integrity of the bed and side of the vehicle. The large cutout for the ramp weakened the unibody frame, made side impacts even more dangerous. Reduced torsional stiffness contributed to flexing and rattles over time. In a rollover or side crash, the Ramside's body offered minimal resistance before collapsing. Though the Ramside was a niche model, it was part of the broader Corvair family, which was famously slammed by Ralph Nader in his landmark 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Nader's criticism focused on the swing axle rear suspension, lack of crash engineering, corporate negligence in prioritizing cost over consumer safety. While the Ramside wasn't singled out, it shared the same engineering DNA, making it just as dangerous, if not more so due to its utility truck form factor and higher center of gravity. The Ramside was clever but confusing for the market. Most buyers didn't understand the handling quirks or safety risks. By the mid-1960s, sales were declining sharply. GM quietly retired the model after 1964. It remains a cult classic today, but many owners retrofit modern suspension parts and add seat belts just to make it drivable. The 1960s Chevrolet Corvair Ramside hid its dangers behind a smile. It was practical, quirky, and eye-catching. But underneath was a platform fundamentally unsuited for safe hauling or transport. It's a lesson in how design innovation without safety foresight can create a vehicle that feels ahead of its time, until it's too late. Number 4, the 1960 Chevrolet El Camino was the second generation of Chevrolet's pioneering car-based pickup truck. It combined the styling of a full-size Chevrolet car with the utility of a compact pickup. Positioned as a sporty work vehicle, the El Camino was aimed at a wide range of buyers, from tradesmen to casual weekend warriors. Its design, built on the Chevrolet Impala's full-size car platform, a bed bolted to the rear instead of a dedicated truck frame, sleek, low-slung appearance, often associated with muscle car aesthetics. A powerful 283 cubic inch V8 engine was optional. However, as with many early car-based trucks, safety was an afterthought. The El Camino was meant to be stylish, affordable, and functional, but its safety design was severely lacking in several critical areas, making it less of a vehicle for practical use and more of a potential hazardous ride. Unlike traditional trucks built on body-on-frame platforms, the El Camino used a unibody car platform. This approach offered benefits such as a lower profile and sleek design, better ride quality compared to a traditional pickup, more car-like handling. However, the unibody construction came with significant compromises. Weaker overall structural integrity compared to the full-frame pickups, especially when it came to handling heavy loads. The suspension system was designed for a car, not a truck, which meant it wasn't equipped to handle the dynamic weight shifts of a full cargo load. While the El Camino's bed could handle a reasonable load, the unibody structure wasn't designed for the same weight-bearing demands as a full-fledged truck. When carrying a heavy load, the suspension sagged and the rear of the truck would lower dramatically. Squatting suspension led to impaired handling and reduced control, especially when making sharp turns or sudden maneuvers. The rear axle could become overloaded, leading to tire wear and unpredictable braking performance. Poor weight distribution, heavily skewed to the back, contributed to skewed driving dynamics, making the vehicle unstable under load. The El Camino was marketed as a multi-purpose vehicle, but in practice it was dangerously impractical for hauling heavy or uneven loads. Although the El Camino was classified as a pickup, it had no additional rollover protection, and this lack of structural fortification made it a death trap in the event of a rollover. Key issues: high center of gravity due to the car-based platform, lack of roof reinforcement or side impact bars to withstand a rollover, no seatbelts in the rear, an early 1960s design flaw common in many vehicles of the era, no roll bars or other rollover protection systems, which became standard in later years in pickups and some cars. In a rollover crash, the unibody construction would collapse, and the lack of strength in the roof and sidewalls meant that the occupants would likely sustain severe injury, particularly if they were unbelted. While the El Camino was marketed as car-like in handling, it was a hybrid in the worst sense of the word. In day-to-day driving, the car-based suspension system made the El Camino understeer-prone in turns and during emergency maneuvers, difficult to control under heavy load due to the rear squatting problem, rough handling when not loaded, which was exacerbated by its high body and unbalanced weight distribution. Moreover, the front-heavy design made it more vulnerable to braking problems under load or during hard stops. The 1960 Chevrolet El Camino was designed for comfort and style, not safety. No seatbelts as standard in the rear seats, and only optional in the 1960 Chevrolet El Camino front. The steel dashboard offered no cushioning or protection in the event of a crash. Rigid, non-collapsible steering column, an outdated feature that increased the risk of injury to the driver in a crash. The side impact protection was practically non-existent, leaving passengers at risk in side impact crashes. The lack of crumple zones meant that in the event of a front or rear collision, the vehicle would absorb much of the impact directly. While powerful engines like the 283 cubic inch V8 were a draw for muscle car enthusiasts, the lack of modern safety features was a major oversight, especially as cars were beginning to adopt more stringent safety standards. The 1960 Chevrolet El Camino remains an iconic vehicle that blended the worlds of passenger cars and trucks in a way that was ahead of its time. Unfortunately, its innovative design came at the cost of safety, with the unibody platform and lack of crash protection making it highly dangerous in the event of a collision or rollover. In the rush to create a stylish, multifunctional vehicle, the El Camino neglected the basic safety features that we take for granted today. While it excelled in certain design elements, it stood as a reminder of how cars from the late 1950s and early 1960s often overlooked crucial occupant protection in favor of style and comfort. Number 3, the 1960 Fargo D100 was the Canadian market version of the Dodge D100, a half-ton pickup truck. Fargo, a brand that Chrysler used in Canada to sell Dodge and Chrysler products, essentially sold rebadged versions of Dodge vehicles, tailored for the Canadian market. The Fargo D100, like its American counterpart, was a car-based pickup that utilized unibody construction rather than the traditional body-on-frame design found in many full-size pickups. The Fargo D100 was designed for utility, offering businesses and individuals a versatile vehicle that could handle both work and daily driving. Despite its practicality, the truck's design came with several critical safety flaws that made it dangerous to drive. While it was marketed as a reliable and affordable workhorse, its safety issues were glaring, issues that were often overlooked in the 1960s as the focus was primarily on utility and aesthetics. Similar to its Dodge D100 counterpart, the Fargo D100 was built on a unibody car platform, meaning it lacked the traditional truck frame typically found in more rugged work vehicles. This design approach was intended to provide the vehicle with a smoother ride and better handling characteristics, similar to a passenger car. However, this structure presented several safety concerns. Reduced structural integrity. Unlike trucks with traditional body-on-frame construction, which are designed to handle heavy loads and impacts, the unibody D100 had a weaker structure, particularly in the event of a crash. This resulted in less protection for passengers in a collision. Susceptible to deformation. In the event of a crash or rollover, the unibody could collapse inward more easily than a traditional frame, increasing the risk of injury. While this design was innovative for its time and aimed to provide a smoother ride, it compromised the truck's crashworthiness. This would become a major safety issue as crash tests became more common in later decades. One of the most dangerous aspects of the 1960 Fargo D100 was its handling characteristics, particularly when compared to modern pickups. A critical issue that plagued both the Dodge D100 and the Fargo D100 was oversteer, a handling flaw that made the truck unpredictable and difficult to control, especially in emergency situations. Light rear end. The truck had a light rear end, which made it prone to skidding or oversteering in tight turns or when braking hard. This was particularly dangerous in adverse weather conditions, such as rain or snow. Vague steering. The steering system in the D100 was also problematic. The truck's front-end geometry was not well suited to tight cornering, and vague steering meant that drivers could easily lose control. Braking issues. The truck used drum brakes, which were already outdated by the time the Fargo D100 was produced. These drum brakes had a tendency to fade quickly under heavy use, especially when hauling loads down steep hills or during sudden stops. With these issues, the Fargo D100 was a truck that was difficult to control in emergency situations, increasing the chances of an accident. The braking system in the 1960 Fargo D100 was one of its most dangerous features. Despite being a common system at the time, drum brakes lacked the stopping power and consistency of disc brakes, which would become more widespread in the coming decades. Overheating and brake fade. Drum brakes were prone to brake fade, especially when subjected to high temperatures from continuous use, such as on long downhill hauls. This meant that after driving for a prolonged period, the brakes would lose their effectiveness and require more effort to stop the truck. Limited stopping distance. When fully loaded, the Fargo D100's braking distance was significantly longer than what was considered safe. In emergency braking situations, the truck's brakes would often fail to provide adequate stopping power, especially on slippery roads. No power assist. Many vehicles of the era also lacked power-assisted braking, which made stopping even harder when carrying heavy loads. The heavy steering combined with weak brakes made it even more difficult to maintain control of the truck during an emergency. These braking deficiencies made the Fargo D100 particularly dangerous when driving in mountainous areas or during bad weather. The truck lacked the safety technology that could have helped the driver avoid or mitigate the effects of an accident. The 1960 Fargo D100, while functional as a work vehicle, was dangerously flawed in terms of safety. Its combination of oversteer, brake fade, and lack of protection for its passengers made it a risky vehicle for daily use, especially in emergency situations. Though it was marketed as a practical, affordable, and stylish option for the Canadian market, the Fargo D100 was a vehicle that prioritized utility over safety. The 1961 Mercury M100 was a pickup truck sold in Canada under the Mercury brand, which was typically associated with Ford's premium lineup. The M100 was essentially a rebadged version of the Ford F100, a half-ton truck that had already been a staple in Ford's American lineup. Mercury trucks were sold in Canada as part of Ford's strategy to offer a more upmarket option compared to the standard Ford trucks, appealing to Canadian consumers who wanted a little more luxury while still maintaining the utility of a workhorse vehicle. Despite the Mercury M100's appearance of a more upscale model, it was still largely identical to the Ford F100 in terms of engineering, build quality, and most importantly, its safety issues. The truck was designed to be a tough, utilitarian vehicle, but it lacked many of the modern safety features we now take for granted. For those who drove the M100, this truck often felt like a punishing experience, with poor handling, outdated braking systems, and minimal crash protection. The Mercury M100 was nearly identical to its Ford counterpart, the F100, when it came to the chassis and engine options, as well as its overall construction. However, being built on the same platform didn't mean that it shared the same attention to safety design. In fact, the M100 carried with it all of the same safety shortcomings that were endemic to the era's trucks, including outdated braking system, vague steering, hard ride with minimal suspension, comfort, dangerous crash protection, or lack thereof. These flaws made the M100 dangerous, especially when compared to modern vehicles that benefit from advances in vehicle safety technologies, such as crumple zones, side impact airbags, and better chassis integrity. In the 1960s, truck safety simply wasn't a priority. One of the most glaring issues with the 1961 Mercury M100 was its braking system, which was inherited from the Ford F100 and was far from adequate by modern standards. The drum brakes on the M100 were inadequate for a truck that could carry heavy loads, and they often faded quickly when subjected to prolonged use, especially when descending hills or hauling weighty cargo. Drum brakes. Like many trucks of the era, the M100 utilized drum brakes, which were not as effective as disc brakes, especially in emergency situations. The older drum brake technology was prone to brake fade, meaning that after sustained use, the braking power would diminish, increasing the truck's stopping distance. Lack of power assistance. Many vehicles in this period, including the M100, lacked power-assisted braking, meaning drivers had to exert considerable force to stop the vehicle, especially under heavy loads. Stopping distance. The overall braking performance of the Mercury M100 was significantly lacking, and drivers often faced much longer stopping distances than today's standards would allow for, putting them at greater risk in sudden stop situations. Another significant flaw in the 1961 Mercury M100 was its handling. With vague steering, the truck was difficult to control, particularly in tight corners or during emergency maneuvers. The M100 steering was imprecise and lacked the feedback that drivers expect from modern vehicles. Vague steering. The steering system in the M100 was prone to wandering, meaning the driver had to exert extra effort to maintain a straight line on the road. This made the truck difficult to drive at high speeds or in busy traffic, especially when sudden maneuvering was needed. Poor suspension. The truck's suspension was stiff and unforgiving, offering little in the way of comfort. The rock-hard ride would punish the driver's spine, particularly on rough terrain or when carrying heavy loads. This lack of suspension comfort made the M100 a physically tiring vehicle to drive, especially over long distances. Unpredictable handling under load. When carrying a heavy load in the bed, the truck's handling became even more unpredictable, as the suspension would not adequately absorb the extra weight. This made the truck prone to oversteering, which could be especially dangerous in wet or slippery conditions. The 1961 Mercury M100 was a reliable work vehicle in the context of its time, but it had numerous safety shortcomings that made it a dangerous option for the everyday driver. With its weak brakes, vague steering, and lack of crash protection, the M100 was not a vehicle you'd want to rely on in an emergency situation. Though it may have been marketed as an upmarket alternative to the Ford F100, the Mercury M100 shared all of the safety flaws of its sibling, leaving occupants vulnerable to injury in the event of a collision. The lack of modern safety features and the unpredictable handling meant that the M100 was a harsh ride that provided little comfort or security for its occupants. Number 1. The 1960s Chevrolet Suburban in its panel truck variant is often regarded as a classic workhorse, designed primarily for commercial and utility purposes. With its rugged build, spacious cargo area, and reliable drivetrain, it was an essential tool for businesses and families who needed a versatile vehicle capable of transporting goods or people. However, while the Suburban was an immensely popular choice for those looking for a functional utility vehicle, it was not designed with safety as a primary concern. In this lecture, we will examine the safety deficiencies that made the 1960 Chevrolet Suburban panel truck variant a potentially dangerous vehicle when used as a pickup truck or family hauler. Despite its iconic status and capabilities, it was prone to fishtailing, lack of rollover protection, and other safety issues that were overlooked by the standards of the 1960s time. First introduced in 1935, the Chevrolet Suburban was initially marketed as a station wagon, though its design evolved over time to cater to a wide range of commercial and military needs. By 1960, the Suburban panel truck variant was part of the Chevrolet CK series trucks, which were built for light-duty utility use. The panel truck variant was essentially a two-door version with a solid rear cargo area, often used for delivery, service, or cargo hauling purposes. It could be seen across a range of uses, from commercial deliveries to families who desired a rugged alternative to a typical passenger vehicle. However, the Suburban's focus on utility meant that comfort and safety took a back seat to durability and versatility. As a pickup truck alternative, the Suburban was often used to transport goods with its flat loading floor, offering ample space. But in the context of family transport, it posed serious safety risks, especially given its lack of modern protective features. One of the most critical safety issues with the 1960 Chevrolet Suburban panel truck variant was the complete absence of rollover protection. Vehicles in the 1960s, especially utility vehicles like the Suburban, were not equipped with the safety mechanisms that are now standard in modern cars, such as side airbags or rollover prevention systems. No crumple zones. The Suburban, built in an era before crumple zones were introduced, had no structural features designed to absorb energy in the event of a rollover. The lack of modern crash engineering meant that, in the event of a rollover, The vehicle's body would not deform in a way that mitigated impact forces on the occupants. Rigid roof. Like many trucks and utility vehicles of the time, the Suburban's roof was built with a rigid design that offered little protection in the event of a rollover accident. Without a reinforced roof or side impact protection, the likelihood of severe injury or death during a rollover was much higher. Top-heavy design. The Suburban's boxy shape and high center of gravity made it particularly vulnerable to rollovers. While it could carry heavy loads, the unbalanced weight distribution led to a greater risk of tipping over, especially during sharp turns or evasive maneuvers. The 1960 Chevrolet Suburban in its panel truck configuration was a sturdy and reliable utility vehicle, but it was also plagued by significant safety deficiencies. The lack of rollover protection, instability while cornering, and absence of basic safety features such as seat belts and side impact protection made it a dangerous option for those using it as a family vehicle or a general-purpose hauler. Although it was a workhorse for many businesses and families, the Suburban lacked the modern engineering required to make it a safe and reliable vehicle in the event of an accident. Today, the 1960 Chevrolet Suburban serves as a reminder of how far automotive safety technology has come and how essential it is to prioritize passenger protection in vehicle design.